Okay, so let's have a quick look at fate and free will in Romeo and Juliet. As ever with PowerPoint, my PowerPoints or little video lessons on a theme, I'll offer a quick definition, a little definition for the theme in question, in this case fate. So a couple of possible explanations or definitions. The development of events outside a person's control, something regarded as predetermined by a supernatural power. Be destined to happen, turn out, or act in a particular way. So what's the relevance of fate to Romeo and Juliet? I mean, I'm sure you know, but let's recap and summarise everything. From the prologue, it is implied that fate lies behind the tragedy that unfolds. Fate is a force that neither the characters nor audience can escape, with many unwitting references to the imminent deaths from both Romeo and Juliet. However, there are many points within the play where different decisions could have been taken, resulting in a different outcome. So just how much of a role does fate play? I mean, I'd point you to the character of Friar Laurence at this point. He's the one adult who's in possession of most of the facts. And and I'd pose the question, if he acted in a different way, would Romeo and Juliet's fate have been different? Both Romeo and Juliet, despite their misgivings or sense of unease, continue to act out of a sense of free will, almost challenging the fate itself, and Romeo in particular does this. So, first thing to look at is probably, well, let's have a look. Okay, areas to consider when considering the theme of fate. Okay, characters: Romeo and Juliet, Friar Laurence. Context: what was the Elizabethans' view on fate and destiny? Well, they believed that one's fate, they believed in fate and destiny for starters, and they believed that one's fate was governed by one of two things: by God or by the stars. I mean, that has great significance for the audience at the time. We'll have a look at the prologue because it set out star-crossed lovers, death-marked love. It sounds there that death-marked love, star-crossed lovers, they're intertwined with fate. What are the consequences of the family feud, certain decisions that were taken, how innocent, how much of a victim was either Romeo or Juliet? And of course, we'll have a look at some useful quotations. Okay, so a word on context. The Elizabethans believed that one's destiny was governed by the stars and by God. So Shakespeare introducing the theme of fate in the prologue would have had an impact on the audience. They would have accepted that the fate of the two young lovers was preordained, and there was as little that they nor anyone could do about it. This probably goes some way to explaining why the friar is always presented as a positive and benign presence throughout. And I alluded to it a minute ago. From reading the play, for me, Friar Laurence has a lot to answer to. His plan was quite outrageous, but he agreed to marry them. Remember, 13 and 16, 17-year-olds. Juliet was soon to be 14. Children, and he's agreed, and I know the context that was an expected or accepted age for young people to get married at the time. However, knowing the family's background, he perhaps could have acted in a different way. Both Romeo and Juliet at different times go to the friar for guidance and support. Maybe he could have acted in a different way. Don't know. But his portrayal throughout the play is a positive one. He's considered wise, knowledgeable, trusted. Okay. So, focusing on Romeo first, he's one of the star-crossed lovers. His love is death-marked from the prologue. Okay, we talked about star-crossed lovers, death-marked. Regardless of decisions he made, maybe it was always destined to end in his death. Other references to fate from Romeo. I fear too early, for my mind misgives some consequence yet hanging in the stars. This is his sense of unease prior to attending the Capulet ball. He has this sense that some consequence yet hanging in the stars. Now, of course, he went to the Capulet ball to meet for the chance to catch a glimpse of Rosaline, who he was madly in love with, but which love was unrequited. She didn't love him back. But he attends the ball despite having this sense of unease. Perhaps if he didn't go, or was he always destined to go? Further on in the play, he cries out, "Oh, I am Fortune's fool," as he realises the consequences of having just killed Tybalt. Now, he killed Tybalt as an act of vengeance against the death of his best friend Mercutio, who died at the hands of Tybalt. But he remembered the prince's warning at the start of the play. Anyone else caught fighting from either of the two families would be executed. Romeo's just married Juliet. He hasn't even spent his first night with her. So he now thinks, as soon as he's killed Tybalt, the consequences, the reality, the harsh reality of what he's just done descends upon him. And he cries out, "I am Fortune's fool." He's angry with himself. But it's almost like he didn't have a choice. He had to seek revenge. He had to kill Tybalt. And towards the end then I defy you, stars. A challenge to fate itself. He's just discovered that Juliet is dead and defies fate, promising to kill himself. Now, Juliet's not really dead. The irony is that he goes to the tomb, he sees Juliet appearing dead, and so he kills himself, and it is that act of killing himself which actually brings about Juliet's own real death. Again, explore or consider the Friar Laurence's role in this. Okay? But Juliet herself, she's the other very young star-crossed lover whose love is death-marked. She also says, "If he be married, my grave is like to be my wedding bed." Interesting, she's foreshadowing her own planned death, because when does she die? When she's lying next to Romeo, not in their own bed, but in their mausoleum, in the funeral bed, if you like, their deathbed. Death marks love. "Methinks I see thee now, thou art so low, as one dead in the bottom of a tomb." Again, she's foreshadowing Romeo's death. She's imagining the worst possible outcome. All these things for the audience feed into this inevitability about how both Juliet and Romeo will ultimately end up. And the friar himself. Of all the characters, it is the friar's decisions that have the biggest bearing on the young lovers. Is it possible to argue that fate was responsible when there were several opportunities for the friar to alter their path? So was it really inevitable that Romeo and Juliet would end up dead? What could he have done? He could have delayed the wedding. He even warned Romeo that these violent delights have violent ends. Again, he foresaw or foreshadowed something terrible ending. Did he delay the wedding? No, he didn't. He married them in secret. They hadn't even known each other for 24 hours. He could have informed the families of their relationship, perhaps bringing peace that way. His justification for not saying anything was he thought that if he could marry them together privately and then announce it to the families, it would bring an end to their ancient grudge. But he didn't. He concocts a highly ambitious and risky plan that ultimately fails. Was this necessary? Was it? Well, he could have spoken to the Capulets then. He could have explained to Juliet's parents why she couldn't marry Paris on the Thursday. And then maybe his worst act of betrayal, perhaps, and I'm being a bit harsh on the old friar, he abandons Juliet in the tomb at the end. Could he have saved her life? He's worried more about being caught himself. And he gets out, leaving her the time required to kill herself. A couple of quotations for the friar, a couple of further ones. "Unhappy fortune, Friar Laurence, as he's told, his letter has not been delivered to Romeo. So his plan, for his plan to succeed, it was fundamental that his letter to Romeo, who was banished to Mantua, was delivered, because it explained to Romeo what the friar's plan was. Without this information, Romeo believes his manservant Balthasar when he says that Juliet's dead. Why wouldn't he? Such an outlandish plan from the friar would have been difficult to second guess if you're Romeo. He also says, a greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intent. Friar Laurence to Juliet in the tomb, with the dead bodies of Romeo and Paris lying nearby. A greater power than we can contradict hath thwarted our intent. He's kind of giving up his role, his responsibility to a greater power, to fate, which is quite convenient for him. Again, I'm being a bit hard on Friar, who is portrayed as a positive and wise and benign presence throughout. Okay, in the prologue, I'm going a bit in reverse here, but in the prologue, references to fate. Fatal loins implies they will die. So the progeny, the descendants, the children of the Capulets and the Montagues, in this case Romeo and Juliet, implies they will die. Star-crossed lovers, their story and destiny is written in the stars. Remember, the Jacobean people believed that it was the stars and God that dictated or ordained how our lives would pan out. Death marks love. Their love is destined to end in death. Naught could remove. So powerless to have arrived at any other outcome, any other scenario. Is that true? Is that the case? Okay, the consequences. Is there anywhere in the chain of events where you think a different decision could have led to a different outcome, or would fate still have found a way? Can you pinpoint any decisions that should have been taken differently? Romeo, I give some examples, or some possibilities. Romeo not attending the ball, especially as he had an ill feeling about it, or not returning to the Capulet mansion for a glimpse of Juliet, where they affirmed their love for each other, and where their excitement overwhelmed them, and where they desired to get married so quickly. Friar Laurence and any one of his decisions, we've talked about them agreeing to marry them secretly, agreeing to marry them so quickly, not speaking to the parents at any point, coming out with this outlandish and risky plan where he'd give Juliet a potion that would give her the appearance of being dead for 24 hours. The nurse, what about the nurse? She turned her back on Juliet when she really needed her. Remember, she was saying that she couldn't marry Paris to her parents, and her parents were disowning her, were threatening to disown her, throw her out on the streets. So she finally she turned in her desperation to the nurse, who was the only one in that room who knew, only adult in that room who knew that Juliet had already married Romeo. And what was the nurse's response? This second marriage will be a better one, she said. Maybe you should marry Paris. Now, is it fair to castigate the nurse for not standing up against Lord Capulet? Remember, patriarchal society, Lord Capulet was the ruler. What he said went. You didn't challenge it. You didn't question it. Lord Capulet himself, maybe, he mistook Juliet's grief for mourning the loss of Tybalt, the death of Tybalt, when in fact it was because of her enforced separation with Romeo. He took, after telling Paris that let's give Juliet another couple of years to grow up a little bit, to get more worldly wise before marrying Paris, he suddenly said, right, no, actually, she can get married in 2 days, on Thursday. That doesn't look good there. Okay, who, if anyone, do you blame for the deaths of Romeo and Juliet? Romeo, Friar Laurence, Lord Capulet, somebody else, and why? Okay, as ever, the final screen, exam relevance. Theme of fate could be incorporated into any question on the characters of Romeo and Juliet. What's great about a question on theme is you can incorporate multiple characters into it as well as discussing the theme itself. So, characters of Romeo, Juliet, Friar Laurence, as explored already. Again, context, Elizabethan attitudes to fate and free will. The creation of tension, adding to the sense of tragedy from the very beginning, the prologue. And Shakespeare's intentions to explore the role of fate in our lives, and maybe to explore how much control we actually have over decisions that we take. Okay, so that's plenty of info on the issue of fate and free will. Hope you found it useful, and we'll see you again.